Hello and welcome to The Stack. For this week's show, we look at the appeal of Japanese magazines, a French publication exploring Japan's cultural trends, and finally, a book about the cult zine Little Joe. Enjoy the show. From Midori House in London, this is The Stack, 30 minutes of print industry analysis, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. I've just returned from a trip to Japan, and it is no surprise that it is the ideal destination for any print lovers out there. My bag was very heavy, I can guarantee, when I returned it, full of magazines. So I had the pleasure this week to discuss Japanese mags with W David Marx, from the importance of print for the Japanese to what magazines we should keep an eye, and, of course, the cult of Popeye magazine. W. David Marx is a cultural historian based in Tokyo and author of two books, Status and Culture, How Our Desire for Social Rank Creates Taste, Identity, Art, Fashion, and Constant Change, and Amatora, How Japan Saved American Style. Let's hear from him.
Print media has been a really important part of Japanese culture for a long time, but especially after World War II, the whole development of the Japanese consumer society was based on magazines. And so you had to teach people what to buy and what they should be thinking about and what they should be aspiring towards. And because of that, the manufacturers and people who made things were very interested in getting into magazines and sponsoring magazines. And so for a really long time, the entire magazine complex has been, backed by the people making things, the consumer goods makers and clothing makers. And because of that, you just have this incredible, spread of magazines across almost every category. And so if you're into outdoor gear, there's multiple magazines for that. And if you're into different kinds of men's fashion, there's, a title for almost every style. And for women's fashion, there's probably more than 20 still at this time. And so, around the world, print media is really struggling and there's fewer and fewer titles. But in Japan, it seems like that whole crisis isn't there. And some of it is because, the magazines are founded with the idea of helping the sponsor, helping these companies sell their goods and sell their worldview. But in general, people still read a lot and especially, people outside of Tokyo want to know what is going on and what is, the correct and right things to buy. And these magazines are so good about showing you, these are the styles that are in, these are the products that are there. And so being kind of a mix between a magazine and a catalog has been a really good fit for Japanese society, where people want to have previews of the things they can shop for once they get to the stores.
And David, in a way, I feel that, magazines here, perhaps in Europe or in the United States, are missing a little bit of that. And this is a guess of mine. But here in London, I've seen more and more places selling magazines like Popeye or Fudge or any other. So do you feel that there's this desire, perhaps, outside of Japan of a similar style, or do you think this would work only in Japan?
No, I absolutely think there's a demand for the Japanese titles, not only because of the format, but also because of the really skillful curation of those magazines themselves and the worldview of those magazines. But if you just take a step back and you think about what is a magazine in the West, Condé Nast empire of magazines in, the let's say 40s or 50s is giving very educated coastal people a sense of, here's what's going on in the big cities and around the world, but they're very much text-based and have wonderful journalism and short stories and things like that. And, still even today, GQ will have, incredible stories, but that's not really how these Japanese magazines work. They're not set up to be things that you sit down and read long articles in. And they all come out of this catalog magazine format, which has a really interesting history, if I can indulge you. In the 60s, there was a magazine called Men's Club, which was a men's fashion magazine. It was pretty rare, and only people who are really into men's fashion read it, but it was very good about showing products off and having some explainers about how Western culture works. And from there, it really inspired a tabloid that came out every week called Heipon Punch, and that was a huge seller, 1 million copies sold every week. But that was very much kind of a text black and white magazine. And Haebon Punch decided in the late 60s they were going to go around the world and report on youth culture. And so in 1969, one illustrator, writer, and an editor went to New York. And when they were there, this editor writer was at Doubleday bookstore and he saw the Whole Earth catalog. So this was Stuart Brand's. It's kind of a strange catalog magazine that shows you the tools to rebuild civilization if you were having to start from scratch. I think Steve Jobs called it the internet before the internet. Yasuhiko Kobayashi, this editor, saw Whole Earth catalog. He did not understand it at all. He did not know what it was, but he was intrigued by it. So he bought a copy. He brought it back to Japan. He showed it to people. Nobody could understand it. But, for years he was obsessed. And so in the early 70s, he was working with this group of editors who had been kicked out of the main publishing house that did Haebon Punch, and more or less pitched them on, we should do something that's like the Whole Earth catalog. And so they made a ski magazine first, and ski magazines used to be really boring and, just about kind of the mechanics of skiing. And instead they made it a goods catalog, and they went to Alaska and shot all these great photos of really cool ski bums in Alaska. And then that was a massive success. So then they did something called the Made in USA catalog. And this is a magazine that's literally just pictures of stuff. There's no articles. It's just literally like they made a catalog, but they made it as a magazine, and there's prices, but they're in dollars because you couldn't buy any of it. And the whole point was just to show people in Japan, here are things that exist in the United States. Massive, massive success. And that basically set the entire formatting standard for Japanese magazines until now. And so this copy of the Whole Earth catalog, which was a really idealistic, pre-internet, countercultural, ideological project, became just a pure consumer magazine in Japan. And then from there set the standard for all of magazines in Japan. But what was really important and why it succeeded is that the consumers in Japan, especially young people, really liked seeing the products. And so from there, those editors went on to found Popeye magazine, and Popeye took that approach to, lots of different kind of subcultures like UCLA, student life, and outdoor life, and later, 80s New York. But that approach of go to a place, do the most thorough guide to the restaurants and the stores and the goods and the clothing, that still exists to this day. And I think it's just an irresistible format. And once people overseas started seeing it, they also agreed. And so even though people can't necessarily read the Japanese text, a magazine like Popeye is quite successful overseas as well.
In a way, you almost don't need it. I mean, although when I read, I do use my little translator on my mobile. But
yes,
talking about Popeye, I mean, there's a cult of Popeye, and it's very exciting. You actually have been a contributor for the magazine.
Yes.
Does the magazine still hold a very special place in the Japanese newsstand?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I personally love it too. I contribute to it, but I'm also always advocating to them to be more global and to try to, be more part of the global conversation, because I really believe it is one of the highest quality magazines globally. And it has this very specific worldview, and it's gone through many incarnations, and its current vibe, I guess is the right way to call it. It starts with Takehiro Kinoshita. He was the editor-in-chief in the late 2000s. He had been at Brutus, which was kind of the big brother magazine to Popeye, as the fashion editor, and moved over to Popeye and reinvented it to have this focus on its original 70s subtitle, which was a magazine for city boys.
Mm-hmm.
And city boys are urban 20-somethings who are sophisticated and interested in fashion, but also go out and live their lives. And so, every year you have, I guess it's about, 12 plus issues, and they're about film or food. Walking Tokyo, they've been doing great guides to Seoul and different travel. They have 2 great fashion issues every year. But it's the thoroughness and the depth, but also a really specific aesthetic, especially what they were doing for Tokyo really changed my whole perspective on the city too, because Tokyo was a place where for a long time, the whole feeling of the city was about the future, that it was the most cutting edge place around the world. And I think it lost that edge around 10 years ago. And Popeye was early in figuring out that was not the value of Tokyo. The value of Tokyo wasn't always being on the cutting edge. It was also that there was this great mid-century, mid-20th century culture of coffee shops and jazz bars and things that were a little bit maybe decrepit or a little old. And Popeye started to mix, the coolest global brands with this very specific, unique feel of Tokyo. And it just ended up with this vibe for the magazine that was really unique and still among Japanese magazines is quite unique. And so I'm always very honored to be a part of it when I get asked. But, some of the reason I'm in it so much, and it's because there's 200 or 300 other people in every issue, which is they'll just have a section that's like, what are your 2 favorite places in Tokyo or something, or 2 favorite places in Kyoto, what's your 3 favorite films? And so you get these columns also where you get to read 20 different people's favorite places in Tokyo. And so, often I'm just a contributor in that list.
And David, a question as well. I just told you I just came back from Tokyo. Of course, there's a sense of amazement every time I go and I look at the newsstand. Where actually do you buy your magazines? And are there any other titles besides Popeye that you have to buy every month? For example, I'm a big fan of Transit. I think as a travel title is fantastic.
This is a very specific thing, but because I work with the magazines, they'll send me copies. And so I am very blessed that I don't have to go out and buy them. But I'm a huge collector of vintage Japanese magazines. And so I have an almost complete run of Men's Club from the mid-1950s to the 1970s and a lot of 80s issues as well. I own a lot of vintage Popeye. And so I take a lot of inspiration reading those 60s and 70s magazines because they're all time capsules and lost worlds, and they're such aesthetic objects, and there's so many great photos. And one of the things that Men's Club did for so many years, and they really invented for Japan, was the idea of street snaps. And so they had a column in the early 60s called Machi no Ivy Leaguers, which means Ivy Leaguers out in the streets. And the idea was that they were trying to convince readers that Ivy League style was a real thing, but nobody dressed that way. And so they took these photos every month of people dressing up like they had seen in the magazine to prove these are real people wearing this clothing. But what's incredible is by doing it monthly for decades, there's almost a perfect record of how people dressed in Japan from the last 40 years. And so I love just going back and seeing those kind of archival photos. And, in every issue, there was probably 30 different people photographed. And so not only do you get the great editorials and advertisements, but just seeing how people really dressed on the streets is something that's a treasure. And I think it's in the UK or US that's probably harder to find photos like that.
I agree. Well, David, I want to talk about you as well. I'm a subscriber of your newsletter, Culture and Owner's Manual. But I'm curious, besides the newsletter, what are your upcoming projects as well? Because, and of course, there's some great books you wrote. The great How Japan Saved American Style from 2015, among others. But give us an update on your projects.
So the last book I did was called Status and Culture, and it's trying to figure out what all those mysteries of culture are, like why culture changes and how media and consumption and all these things come together, and to put it all in one book and explain that. And so I did that. And the new book I'm working on that should come out at the end of 2025 is an extension of a lot of what I was writing, but in a historical context and format. And so it's going to be a cultural history of the 21st century from about 2001 to 2025, and explains how we got to where we are now in terms of culture. And a lot of that's not necessarily a celebration. That I think that we've moved from this very 90s spirit of DIY and indie and liking things because they don't make money to really everyone focusing on money, money, money. So looking at that transition, looking at things like the ideology of youth culture changing. So I'm working on that. I'm kind of halfway through writing it, but it's a combination of my 2 books in that it's a straight history like Amatora, but trying to understand the mechanisms of how culture works, like Status and Culture.
Thank you so much, W David Marx. You can subscribe to his newsletter on culture.ghost.io. And now we stay in Japan via France. Tempura is an independent French publication dedicated to exploring Japan's cultural trends beyond the usual stereotypes. Monocle's Gabriel Grangier spoke with Emile Pachar Valencia, the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly magazine, based in Paris and Tokyo. Although currently only available in French, you will soon be able to discover the wonderful and visually striking world of tempura in English in the coming year.
We started the magazine because of this bond that, it's been pretty strong since many, many years. It's not a recent history, actually. This started like in the 18th, 19th century with the first travelers to Japan. This relationship has changed and has gone through many phases. And then I think the big boom for our generation was the manga and anime that we watched on TV, and that has created a whole generation of fans of Japan, people who are now in their like 30s, 40s, that have traveled to Japan, discovered the culture more deeply, but still there were no media who talked about Japan in another way than just like presenting what we already like and know, which is manga and anime, pop culture actually. But the interest about Japan was still very strong. So we found that there was a gap there. We wanted to fill this gap and to talk about Japan in another way. So to talk about, for example, I don't know, feminism, gender, identity, social issues, to understand what's happening now in Japan, the decrease of population, how is it impacting society in many, many ways. So we started the magazine to answer those questions. And because also we found out that those first fans of Japan, they wanted also to know a little bit more deeply about the culture. But again, they couldn't find any media or any newspaper who talked about exclusively about Japan in that way. So that's why we started the magazine in 2020, just right before the pandemic. But we're still there.
Yeah, no, that's what I love about each issue. It's like there's always one theme that the magazine delves into very deeply. And I was wondering, what's the process to choose the theme that you're going to explore in one issue?
It's very organic. So it really depends on the people I'm going to meet there. I spend now like half year in Tokyo. In Japan because I travel when I'm there, but it really depends on the people I'm going to meet, the news I'm going to read. And what we try to do is not to answer to hot topics. We try to focus more like on trends and to try to understand how society is changing. And also, when we choose our topics, we try to choose subjects that Europeans, Westerners can reflect on. For example, when we talk about feminism in Japan, of course, it made us think about our own way of seeing feminism in Europe, for example. Some things that we take for granted. And by looking at another culture, which way they deal with those issues, sometimes it can make you question what you think, what you take for granted, what you think you know, what you think it's the normal way to act or to behave. So this way, people who don't have a keen interest in Japan can read our magazine because they want to broaden their point of view. So the topics, it's always, we try to focus on topics that people can relate to. And sometimes it's just like through discussions with journalists. We have a pool of journalists in Japan, and sometimes they come to me because I'm chief editor. So they come to me with a topic. If I see there's something there that we can dig, I just say, okay, let's go. And that's how we construct each issue. It's very organic.
Yeah, and so the same thing goes for the people that you interview in the magazine. It's like through meeting them, because it's often very personal stories. So I was wondering how you pick who you interview.
That's the work of the journalists. They have a lot of connections. They know how to go and find the right person to interview. And again, our positioning is very tricky in a way because we are a French magazine talking about another culture that's not our own culture. So the way we found to solve this very tricky issue is to give a voice to the people we talk about. So that's why we have so many interviews, so many reports, so many profiles. We try to give a voice to the people we talk about and not to talk in their name. So of course it's not perfect, but it's a way to try to avoid to over-explain things. So we let them explain what they feel, what they like, what they think about. So that's one of the ways. And of course, we work with foreign journalists who live there, who has been living there for 10, 15 years, 20 years, who can speak Japanese and so on. So now our team is pretty consolidated, and we have a good, very talented pool of journalists, photographers, etc. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the photography and just the visual language in tempura because it seems as important as the written content. And I was wondering how instinctive that was for you from the start.
Well, that comes because we are three co-founders. One of our co-founders, Clemens, she's the art director of Tempura. And by discussing with her, we wanted to create a magazine that's pleasant to read. And the experience of reading a paper magazine is totally different than when you read online, right? But at the same time, when you look at newspaper or like magazines that talk about social issues that are pretty deep in the content, usually the visuals are a little less powerful because what matters there is the content, the written part, right? But we thought that the two can work together. So it's not because you talk about very serious issues, because sometimes we talk about serious issues that are not like very pleasant, but that's the reality of things. But at the same time, we take care of the visuals, the photographs, and the way the layout is made, because it's an experience to read a magazine. So it's a full experience. It's not just the words you read, it's how the visuals will impact you, how it communicates with the words. Our challenge was to create a magazine that's very pleasant, very beautiful. I mean, we try to, it's not perfect yet, but we try to better it on each issue. So a magazine that's very pleasant to read, that's beautiful, that you want to keep on your bookshelves, but at the same time, who has serious topics written by professional journalists. That was the challenge. And in that way, I think today there are not many magazines like that, because on the other hand, when the magazine is very beautiful, there's so much like niche magazines today about design, photography, graphic design, whatever. Usually the content, the written part is not very deep. It's not the important thing. It's more like collectibles magazines, so that you want to put on your coffee table because it looks good to have it there. But you never really read it because the content is not there. So yeah, we wanted both. It's very challenging, but it's very exciting at the same time.
To me, it's something that Tempura has mastered. I think every issue, it's always incredible. Like the balance between the two, it works so well. So I'd be delighted if more people could discover it. So I wanted to know if you could talk about the decision to expand to the English language sphere soon.
Yeah, pretty soon. I think next year, actually. Yeah, the magazine is going to change quite a lot in the next few months. Now we are quarterly, so maybe the periodicity also will change. The content will remain pretty much the same, meaning that, yeah, we're going to keep the way we do things. So with journalists and our reports and so on, and professional photographers and so on. But we're going to maybe make it a little bigger. We're going to make it maybe bilingual or an English version per se. But yeah, we want to, because we noticed that even in English-speaking countries like the US, the UK, there are not many magazines like us, like talking about Japan in that way. And also because in Japan, and when I meet people who cannot speak French, they always tell us, oh, I wish I could read it. I wish you make an English version, even for Japanese people, because many Japanese people can read English. So I think that's I don't think it is our next like big project for next year, to make an English version of Tempura. And that way we can reach a much broader readership.
And finally, I have a little bonus question. Why the name Tempura? I was wondering.
It comes from a Portuguese dish. The funny thing is that when you talk about Japanese people about tempura, half know, but half don't know. It's not originally a Japanese dish. It came from Portugal, from missionaries in the 17th century, when the country was very closed at that time. They came with that dish, which comes from tempura, which is a Christian dish, fried dish, that was eaten in a very specific time. Anyway, so they brought this dish to Japan, and Japanese people loved it. So they tried to remake it, and it changed through time very, very much. It doesn't have any link today. I mean, you cannot compare it to the original dish, but still the name became, it comes from tempura to tempura. So even now, people don't know in Japan, many people don't know that it's not originally Japanese. So we found this story very inspiring because we are a French magazine about Japan, and this kind of like influence, mix of cultures, and how something that you think has an identity can change through time and take another identity. And those questions are very inspiring to us. Also, because today we tend to put barriers between cultures, identities, and this story tells us that whatever the barriers you build, because at that time, as I said, Japan was closed to foreign countries, whatever the barriers you make and you build, cultures and ideas will always circulate and will always mix and will always influence each other. And that's very enlightening. I mean, it goes the same way with Japanese curry, for example. Now it's a dish, but it's not Japanese. I mean, it has become Japanese. Without those influences, I think many cultures would have lost many things. In France, for example, we would have lost wine without the US, or oyster or whatever. So silk also. I mean, so many stories of mixing cultures that inspired us.
Thank you, Emile and Gabrielle. And the latest issue of Tempura is out now. And finally, I had the pleasure to speak with San Ashby in our studio. San is the founder of cult zine Little Joe that ran from 2010 to 2021. The title was a rebellious queer take on film history. It was an in-depth look at the often forgotten and overlooked films, from obscure art films to porn to Hollywood classics. Little Joe was print-only and kind of hard to find. The new book, Little Joe, a book about queers and cinema, mostly, retells the story of the zine and some of its best stories. Let's hear from San, who is also a very good film poster designer.
We started it just, kind of very tiny little idea to create a little film zine, and really started from scratch and really working my contacts to try and find a kind of a group of people to come on board as contributors. And because we had no idea how to do a magazine, I mean, I spent I say we, it was really me on my own at the beginning. And I spent a year sitting on all of this material, didn't know how to deal with it. I was a designer already, but I just couldn't figure out how to design a zine. I'd been designing film posters until that point. And so I'd always been working with a single image. So the idea of a sequential book format, because we did this small book format, really eluded me for ages. And I ended up working with a friend and trying to get his help just to kind of turn it into something. And then he ended up moving on to something else. So it was really finally left with me to deal with it. So it just kind of was this small thing that I never really expected to sell. We did 500 copies of the first issue. And I knew that it was kind of cool, and because I was really interested in the subject, queer cinema from the margins, from the underground. But I just had no idea that it would take off. And so once the 500 sold out, we were just let's do another issue. We didn't think about reprinting ever.
So it's quite organic in that sense.
Yeah.
How many issues overall?
We did 6, and we did 5 in 5 years, and then had a big break, and then we did a kind of a COVID issue, I guess.
But don't you see, I mean, that's for me the power of print, because I remember Little Joe, you didn't have such a massive kind of online presence, or, it was very much about the print product, right?
Yeah.
And look at the power of that. There's a new book out, which I think a lot of people will be interested. Was that the reason you did the book? How did it came about? You wanted to kind of create this amazing anthology, perhaps as a celebration of that decade of Little Joe?
Yeah, for me, the fact of its kind of hard to findness, the fact that it was kind of difficult, at its peak we were printing 2,000 copies, but they would sell pretty quickly and then we wouldn't reprint. And because the whole project was kind of anti-internet in some way, I really wanted to kind of privilege the object as something that would kind of pass from hand to hand. And there's kind of an erotic kind of potential in the book that I've always found, particularly as a queer person growing up finding queer material in the margins. So for me, I really wanted to create something that kind of carried that power. And so the idea that I would put all of this stuff online just seemed kind of counter to this kind of tactile, erotic thing that Little Joe was to me. And so the idea of creating something that would kind of stay true to that, but would at least allow this amazing material to be like available to more people, that was a huge part of the desire to do a book. And we've got 6 issues of material kind of squished into one 512-page book.
It's a big book, I have to say. Yeah, I think it's definitely worth. And I mean, I must ask this question. I think a lot of people who are big fans of Little Joe, I mean, this book is amazing. Is there scope for an upcoming issue? Or what can you tell us about that?
It's hard to say for me. I think at once this feels like a line in the sand, you know, kind of a tribute to the project, allowing it to kind of continue in the process of doing the book. I felt like this felt like an unfinished project. Like this feels like a volume 1, maybe of a project that could continue. So I think maybe I'll see how the response is to the book. And I know the publisher is really excited about it. SPBH Editions and Mac Books have very generously, you know, put this out there. So I think if it sells, maybe there's scope to do another project with them. But yeah, I feel very tenderly towards this project. And I think the fact that it feels like unfinished business might mean that it comes back, but we'll see.
But I find it fascinating that when you started Little Joe, you were working already with design, especially film poster design. I think such a fantastic transition because I love print and I love film posters as well. Like sometimes I want to buy kind of those vintage ones, you know, it's quite special. So, and that's a work you still do, right? And you've done amazing. Would you mind telling us some of the posters you've done recently or the most, I don't know, your favorite ones?
Thank you. Yeah, I've been doing film posters for, like maybe 20 years. I sort of fell into the industry and never studied design formally, which I think is partly why I struggled with the idea of doing the book or designing it myself.
It looks great. Please.
Thank you. Well, the book was designed by Brian Paul Lamott, who's the publisher's designer. Yeah, he's done a lovely job of like distilling the zines into a book. My background in posters has always kind of been on the art house end of the scale. And I was lucky enough to work with Andrew Haigh, who directed Weekend and All of Us Strangers. So that was Weekend was like an early one for me. And then All of Us Strangers is a more later, recent project for me. So I kind of feel like those two really stand out for me, particularly as kind of queer films that have really kind of crossed over into a kind of a mainstream consciousness. What else?
Breakfast on Pluto, was that your first one? I think I saw
that
somewhere.
That was the very first design I did for a company called Empire when I was a runner over there. That was a poster that never made it to the final thing, but that was kind of I guess, oh wow, I might be kind of okay at this kind of moment. Another big early one for me was Control, the film about Joy Division. And that was a very happy accident at my first proper job, All City. Yeah, and then I went kind of solo and was, you know, designing for small independent companies for years. And now I'm back freelancing again. Yeah, it's nice.
Well, let's go back to the book. So in terms of content, the magazine was always about, or the zine always about kind of overlooked films, but there was a sense of humor to it as well, right? I mean, and to be honest, I discovered a lot of films, you know, reading Little Joe, because you don't want to just talk about perhaps what's the mainstream. Nothing against the mainstream, but you know what I mean. So was that the type of content you wanted as well? I mean, of course, you have John Waters as well, which is an amazing, perhaps a bit more known figure, but what's the type of content for Little Joe?
For me, Little Joe was always about this kind of, I guess, this wink, this like, it's about this sense of humor, this kind of sideward glance at things. And so I grew up in a world where there was very little kind of queer representation in film and TV. And those representations that there were kind of a bit, you know, kind of crap, to be honest. As I was kind of growing older and I guess in my 20s, I was really discovering that there was a whole wealth of films made by queer people for queer people, and that those were made with a spirit that was very much kind of, I felt very connected to. So like a really playful, kind of political and often quite angry spirit that was like driving a lot of this material. That was the kind of stuff that I was like, okay, wow, there is a whole other world out there that I hadn't really discovered. And so Little Joe as a project kind of became a way for me to kind of dive into this world. and to share that with other people.
How do you see the current scene of queer cinema? I know it's so vast, right? I mean, the different types, but do you feel optimistic? I mean, because there's much more of it, right, than even a decade ago. I don't know. I feel there's more and more.
Yeah, like, I feel like that was such an interesting thing about putting the book together now, a decade after the first, more than a decade after the first, 15 years after the first issue. I think there's so much more out there. There's, like, representationally, like, it's incredible to be growing up now and not to have to kind of find the stuff in the corners, in the margins, as I had to, and many people had to. So I think that is incredible, and I think that is going to create a totally different generation in terms of how people see themselves. I think on the mainstream end that we are kind of getting great examples of that. Like, I feel like films like I already mentioned Andrew Haigh and All of Us Strangers, but that was something that I felt like could have only been made by someone of my generation who grew up in the same way that I did, but wanted to kind of make a film that addressed all of those kind of issues that I think people growing up under the shadow of AIDS kind of had or have. And so for me, it's amazing to see queer cinema now really grappling with some of these issues in a way that is connecting with the mainstream. And yeah, you kind of mentioned this concept of the mainstream, and yeah, I feel like there are some things that appeal to Little Joe that are in the mainstream, but I think there's other things that I think, you know, there's still a long way to go. But do we really need to have this mainstream recognition? Do we really want to find ourselves in the mainstream? Like, I guess that's also a question that I'm thinking about now. It's like, what does it mean to be mainstream? Are we just in this kind of commercial space now where we're understood as another market, the same as everyone else? Like, what does it mean to create work and put it into this space? So, I don't know. I think there's like these tensions that I think are really interesting now. And I think if Little Joe was to kind of come back in a kind of regular format, I think it would kind of have to be dealing with a lot of these things. I think representationally, Little Joe was always kind of improving itself as it went along. Our first issue was very exclusively gay male. Mm-hmm. And then I think that really like transitioned in our last issue. Like it could kind of finally call itself a queer magazine. That's something that I think I would love to see happen if Little Joe continued. But maybe it's also okay that it existed in its time, and you know, I think it was doing a good job in its time.
I love how you're leaving it open in the air. Yeah. I like that. Organic. And, you know, finally, I just want to send, I love the video library session of the book as well, because I think you get to know someone quite well about some of, you know, the films they would put in their video library. So, you know, we have Rick Castro here, you have John Cameron Mitchell. I don't want to put you on the spot, but give me at least like 3 films that would be on your video library.
Oh,
sorry, I know those are the hard questions. I know that, but
oh my God, this is really gonna.
Sorry.
No, this is great. I think I'm trying to think about the films that really defined me. I mean, Dirty Dancing was like probably one of my favorite movies as a kid, and it's one of those kind of forbidden films that like I was just too young to watch it, and my sisters kind of were watching it at home on video.
It's a classic.
And I feel like that like gave me this view of the world that I think I had no sense of until that point. In terms of like queer cinema, I mean, this is what I always find interesting, is like what defines a queer film. But
because some, let's say, straight films can be queer somehow. I don't know how to explain this, but
yeah, I think we kind of get to read our own way into things, right? I think that's always the fun of it, like the way that we read things. Like the idea of camp is such a kind of queer notion that defines how we see the world. I would have to include a John Waters film, and the one that I grew up with was Serial Mom, which is such an absurdist kind of take on like the serial killer film. But I love Kathleen Turner's performance in that so much. And speaking of camp, I mean, it is like high camp. The whole film is perfect. And then maybe something a bit more left field, something that I think would appeal to the Little Joe readers. Something like Funeral Parade of Roses. I don't know if you've seen this Japanese film from the 70s. It's kind of a trans take on the Oedipus complex, on the Oedipus story, I should say. It's incredibly beautiful. And that's something that's like a queer film that I think came into a world that was like fully accepting of it at the time. And I think like that's the fascinating thing about doing this project, is that you see that these films existed in a moment, and that moment is so specific, and that the moment that we're in now feels like weirdly less open to some of these ideas. Like there's a kind of sense that things are kind of shifting away from, or shifting out of our grasp, and that things feel a lot more Puritan, and people are scared to kind of be bold again. And I think that's why it's important to me doing a project like Little Joe, is that you realise that nothing is original. So much of this work has been done before us, and you realise that taking it out of the context of the past and bringing it into the space now teaches us a lot.
Thank you very much, Sam Ashby. And Little Joe, a book about queers and cinema, mostly, is out now. For more information, go to littlejoemagazine.com. And that's it for this week's show. My thanks to our editor, Jack Dewars. Any comments or queries, feel free to write to me, Fernando, at fp@monocle.com. We'll be back next Saturday at 10 a.m. London time. Meanwhile, subscribe to The Stack on Apple Podcast and Spotify. You've been listening to The Stack. I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.